Okay, there he is. Hi. Okay, thank you. Checking that you can hear me now, and if somebody could talk to me to make sure I could hear you, that would also be great.
We can hear you. Can you hear us?
Excellent. I can hear you. Okay, so we're going to go on the air now. Then the source sheet is in the chat, um, and we okay. So what I want to do today, I'm going to share. Yes. Whoops! I did the wrong thing. Sorry. My fault. This is what happened several weeks where I pressed the play instead of record. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, so what we're gonna do tonight is start off by doing some of the things we do as on a regular basis, which is to analyze, start with a pasuk, put that pasuk in the context of the overall narrative, address the question of not only where it fits literarily, but where it fits chronologically and how the chronological and literary interrelate. And then after we've done that, I want to move that into a discussion of the famous Haggadah of Moshe in Rabbi Akiva's classroom, and suggest that Haggadah is related to the to the literary analysis we did, and then take some time to discuss that narrative in its own terms. There's a sort of slight amusement, right? So the written Torah this week is going to be about about that Haggadah, and I titled it sort of as a joke, a review of Aryeh Borges's Life of Moses, even though, to my knowledge, Borges had not actually written a Life of Moses. For those of you who appreciate his work, you would know that it wouldn't be out of character for him to write a review of a non-existent work. And then I looked on the web and I discovered that there was a review already of this work, and I had missed it, not known it, and I was very excited. But it turned out that the other review was also of somebody imagining a fictional work. So there'll be some imaginative elements involved. Okay, so here's the pasuk. Right, the pasuk is Shemot Lamed Aleph Yud Chet, and it reads as follows: Vayitein el Moshe. So he gave to Moshe Kechaloto da birito bahar Sinai. So we're going to translate Kechaloto literally now, meaning as at the end, right? At the end, it doesn't say Bichaloto, it says Kechaloto. So you could try and decide whether you think the Ke means approximately as opposed to precisely. When he finishes speaking with him at Har Sinai, and he gives him the two luchot oidut with a description of what they are. They're made of rock and they're ktuvim be'etzba Elohim, whichever we want, right? A powerful etzba, a divine etzba. That's the image which is also drawn in the Makos when the Chartavim say to Paro etzba Elohim he. Okay, we're not interested this week in the description of the luchot. What we're interested in is this claim of some kind of temporal connection, chronological connection, that the luchot are given to Moshe roughly at the time that God finishes L'daber ito, or that God and Moshe finish speaking with each other. So when is that time? Okay, when is that time? When does God, right? When is the time that Moshe gets the luchot, which is at the end of God and Moshe speaking? So Rishon ben Lakish says the following, and he just basically he undermines the whole temporal connection by translating Kechaloto not as when it finishes. So Rabbi Rishon ben Lakish, anybody who finds Divrei Torah, or anybody who studies Motzei Divrei Torah, so somebody who speaks out Divrei Torah, and the words that you say to your audience are not as pleasing to your audience as a bride is to a groom, it would have been better not to say them. This is one of those very scary things to open a shir with, right? Because maybe I should stop talking, right? You have to tell me whether you find my words that attractive or not. Right, Lama. So where do we get this idea that you should only say Divrei Torah if your audience really appreciates them that profoundly? Because in the time when Hashem gave the Torah to the Jews found the original giving of the Torah. The Jews were as attracted to the Torah as a groom at a wedding, and therefore, since we want every teaching of Torah to be a recreation of the original Matan Torah, therefore you should be very careful that you only teach Torah to a highly appreciative audience. So how do we get that? So Vayitain el Moshe kichaloto, we translate as kichalato. So he gave them, right? So he gave them the luchot to Moshe, like as if he were giving them to his kala. Okay. So this, first of all, right, this doesn't fit very well in the pasuk as a whole because it doesn't say l'daberi tov b'har Sinai. Can you translate the whole pasuk that he gave it to Moshe like a bride to speak with him? Not so great. Secondly, he gave it to Moshe. He didn't give it to Bnei Yisrael, right? In Rosh ben Lakish's analogy, the Baal is the Jewish people, and the Torah is the bride. Right, so that's an interesting use of the marriage metaphor. But really, in the story, it's Moshe. So that's right. That's also right. We could spend time if we were doing the midrash in its own terms. We could deal that as well. I'm interested in two things. Right. One is he translates kichalato not as at the finish. So that could just be that he's doing what midrash does, which is we talked about. I think last week also that midrash believes you have to interpret the harmonics and not just the melody. And so your misunderstandings, especially those that are driven by an unvocalized text, because there's no vav for kichaloto, so you could, if you just read it, you would read it as kichaloto. So the Medrash is just taking advantage of the harmonic and translating it as kala. It doesn't mean kala, bride, as opposed to at the end of. It just means in addition to. That's very reasonable. That's one thing to get out of it, right? So it could be that it's doing this because it has difficulty with the timing, or it could be that it's doing it just because it thinks that there are multiple meanings. And the second thing is to talk about, so who is the bride and who is the groom? So in the verse, it has to be that Moshe is the groom and the luchot are the bride. But in the analogy, it's obviously the right, Bnei Yisrael are the groom and the Torah is the bride. So let's take the next one, which is also in Lema Roshim Bar Lakish. So Amar Levi, Amar Roshim Lakish. So just like brides apparently went through a regimen even more comprehensive than Megillat Esther lists specifically, where there are 24 different kinds of cosmetics. So the analogy is drawn between scholars and a bride, and just like scholars are supposed to know all of Tanakh, all 24 Sfarim of Tanakh, the way that a bride has these 24, which must have been on some kind of standard magazine list of these 24 kinds of cosmetics. And that's what kichalato means. He gave it to Moshe kichalato. So now I have to figure out, okay, who is the bride and who is the groom? So the Talmid Chacham is the bride, and Torah is now the cosmetics. Right? So Rish Lakish's first version is that the Moshe or the Jewish people are the groom, and the Torah is the bride. Now the bride is our scholar. The brides are scholars, and the Torah is a cosmetic, and the groom has shifted out of the picture. We don't know who the groom is at all. So what interests me, aside from the intrinsic interest of that claim and of who plays what, is that even if you interpret kichaloto as meaning kala, so there's a grammatical ambiguity, right? One interpretation is he gave the Torah to Moshe as he would give Moshe, he gave the Torah to Moshe as he would give a kala to Moshe, and the other is he gave the Torah to Moshe as he would give cosmetics to a kala. Right, so you understand that there are grammatical ambiguities as to the relationship between Moshe and the term kichaloto, and I want to pick up on that towards the end of this year. Okay, then and I'm quoting the Midrash Rabbah, although not in the order they're presented in Midrash Rabbah. So now Rabbi Abba says, all 40 days that Moshe Rabbeinu was on top of the mountain, he was learning Torah and forgetting it, and he said to the Rebbe Shalom, 40 days, and I don't remember anything. So what does God do? Right, so after the 40 days, God looks at Moshe and says, you're right, you're not remembering anything. So he stops trying to teach it to Moshe, and he just gives it to Moshe. Right, when he gives it to Moshe as opposed to teaching it to Moshe, and so this is a drash on the word vayitain. But it's possible that it's also a drash on the word kichaloto, the berito, which does mean when he finishes, meaning when he'd given up teaching Moshe the Torah. That's what kichaloto, the berito meant, right? He spent 40 days and 40 nights, right? So we're locating, right? He gives Moshe the luchot just before Moshe goes down at some point, and then we have the obvious question. So why does it take 40 days and 40 nights for him to give him the Torah? And the answer is he tries for 40 days and 40 nights to teach Moshe the Torah, but then kechalotol deberito, when he gives up teaching him, he just gives Moshe the Torah, and Moshe gets the Torah as a gift. Okay, then there's another way of another midrash that also explains Vayitena Moshe in a particular way, maybe related, maybe not. The Chikol Torah Lamad Moshe, that Moshe learned the entire Torah. The Torah itself describes, or the Tanakh describes itself as too wide and wider than the earth and deeper than the sea. So how could Moshe in 40 days have learned the entire Torah? Forget the Moshe who didn't remember anything. Even if Moshe remembered everything, how could God teach him everything in 40 days? So you can say, look, obviously, as some Rishonim say, like, this is a silly question. God can do anything. He can teach you in 40 days. Okay, can human beings learn everything in 40 days? Okay, Moshe Rabbeinu is unique. Whatever. But this Midrash is bothered by that question, and his answer is, which has real implications, is Ella Klalim Limdu HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So God taught Moshe the Torah not in detail. He taught it to him in general rules, and this is a new pshat in the word kichaloto, not like a bride, and not when he finishes, but as kal becomes a rule as panam klal. He taught it to him in principles, and therefore what we're doing in the future, right? Even though there are things in Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu was never taught specifically, he was only taught them generally. That's a pretty radical claim, and it's built to some extent on the notion. I think it's also pshana kechalotol deberito, not just that it's principles as opposed to specifics, but it also means, like, if God has to teach Moshe the entire Torah in detail, how could he ever finish? Right? The Torah is infinite, and so God should have kept Moshe on the mountain forever. So I think this midrash is to some extent also a drasha on, like, how could it be that Moshe, there's a place at which God speaks to Moshe and gives him the Torah. So the most radical way of saying it would be, you know what, God didn't teach Moshe the entire Torah. He taught him part of it. It was enough to send him down. And then he taught him the rest later. Then we have to figure out, why does he teach him these things and not other things? But in this case, the answer is that anything, right, even in an infinite series, can be contained in a finite series of rules. So God teaches Moshe the infinite Torah in a finite series of rules, if you're comfortable saying that the Torah can be reduced to a finite set of rules. For our purposes, the key thing is that here again you have this discomfort with kichaloto literally meaning when he stopped. And the answer here is not the reason for the discomfort here is not so much the chronology, as that it didn't really happen when he stopped talking, as what sense would it be to say that there's a point at which God stops teaching Moshe Torah? But there's another midrash that seems to lean into this notion. So l'daberito, so milamed Moshe shomea b'pi hagvura v'chozrim v'shonim et halacha shnehem yachad. So now we're talking about pedagogy, right? So what does l'daberito means? It means that Moshe would hear what God said, and then after Rebbeinu Shalom said it to Moshe, then they would repeat it together, right? This is good old-fashioned pedagogy. And right, that's the original version. But then Rosh Lakish sharpens it. He says, "What does l'daberito mean? Here's a mashal. There's a teacher learning from the student. Right at the very beginning, when the student hasn't learned it, then the teacher says it and the student repeats it. But once the student gets it, right, then Amir Rabbi, the teacher says to him, Bo v'amar aniva ata. Let's say it together. Right, it's a different kind of pedagogy, as opposed to right. It's not that we say it, and we say everything and then we learn it and then we repeat it. Right, the sharpening is that there's a progression in the student. So too, Moshe Rabbeinu, when he goes up to Shemayim, first he repeats the Torah after God, and then once he learns it, then God says to him, Bo v'nomra ani v'ata. So this is another attempt to explain what changes, like what's kechalotol deberito. So kechalotol deberito means that God doesn't stop with Moshe until the point where they reach the stage where it's the deberito, as opposed to the deberi lav. Right? God doesn't just teach it to Moshe and then the conversation is over. Whatever happens in the 40 days and 40 nights has to be a finishing, and the finishing is it's the stage at which Moshe Rabbeinu has repeated the Torah together with God, as opposed to just heard it from God. So Shimshon Raphael Hirsch takes this, what I think is, he learns what I think is pshat in the Midrash. And what he says is, Ulam, right, in the very beginning, when when the mitzvahs of God are called dibur el Moshe, they're called speaking to Moshe, and Moshe's job was b'sheva al tasa, was passive, the kabel b'liklot, to receive and to retain. But now kichaloto, before the end of Matan Torah, Moshe has already absorbed the Torah well, and he quotes Rish Lakish's. Hainu, what does that mean? She'ata Moshe chozer v'dan binyan be'ofen pa'il. Now Moshe studies the topic and evaluates issues in an active manner, biyachad im Hashem. Right. So Rav says that the Torah, right, God doesn't give Moshe the luchot until Moshe already has ownership of the Torah intellectually, that he's capable of thinking about it independently, and he's in a conversation with God, as opposed to just as a passive absorber. So this is also an attempt to explain kichaloto, right? But it's not so great, because kichaloto, the berito, right? Really, what we wanted to say is that when he was done, so that they were speaking together, and not when he was done speaking together. So there's a tension here, right? Right. It's certainly right that l'daberi to is not the same thing as l'daberi lav, and it sounds like it's a reasonable interpretation of l'daberi to is speaking with him as opposed to speaking to him. But what does it mean? But it's not really a good explanation of why God is finished speaking with him now. Really, God is never going to be finished speaking with him, because now they're in permanent conversation about Torah. And why would you give the luchot, right? And there's a sort of anticlimax in God giving Moshe the luchot after he's already learned it all. All right. So what are the luchot for if Moshe already absorbed everything? Right, so I think there are weaknesses in the midrash, but I think our first gets the midrash really right. Okay. We have a whole bunch of interpretations of chaloto, right? It might mean like a bride. Even if it's a bride, there's a grammatical ambiguity as to who the bride is, and right, is there a groom, and what the Torah, right, and what the Torah is. Then we have the possibility that it means when he finished, but there's some difficulties grammatically trying to figure out exactly what he finishes, and we're not actually really satisfied by it. We also have the idea that kichaloto means klalim. Right? Lots of difficulties interpreting what seems to be a fairly straightforward verse. Now we get to the heart of what I think is the heart of the issue. Vayitain el Moshe. So some anonymous rabbanim say, Ilu asu Yisrael oto ma'aseh ad shelo nitnahu luchot l'Moshe, lo hayu yordin biyado. Had the Jews done that deed, now what does that deed mean? That deed means Egel Zahav, the golden calf. Had the Jews done that deed before God gave the luchot to Moshe, then the luchot would never have gone down to Moshe with Moshe, right? It wouldn't have the dramatic scene of Moshe breaking them. The luchot would still be in Shemayim. So this scene, okay, what the Rabbanan say is this scene, when it says God gave it to Moshe when he finished speaking with Moshe, that scene has to take place before the Egel HaZahav, which is fine, because Egel HaZahav takes place in the next parak. So that just basically tells you the Torah is in chronological order from now, perhaps, or at least those two scenes, the giving of the luchot and the Egel, are in chronological order, although we don't know what happened before or whether anything happens in between. But Rabbi comes up with a radical claim. He says, Misha osu oto maaseh natana kadosh baruch hu l'Moshe taluchot. No, the luchot were given by God to Moshe after the Egel HaZahav. Ki Moshe kasuv vayitain el Moshe kichaloto l'daberito. Right, he gave it to Moshe when he finished speaking with him. So, right, Rabbi says, there's no way you can say that God finishes speaking with Moshe before the Egel happens. Why is that? Because, as we'll see, when the Egel happens, God tells Moshe about it. And when God tells Moshe about it, Moshe and God have a conversation. So how can you say that God gave Moshe the luchot before the Egel, and when he finished speaking with him, when God tells him about the Egel, a whole conversation happens and Moshe hasn't gone down yet. So Rabbi Levi really addresses the chronological problem directly, and he says there is an incoherence in the story chronologically. How can we say it's when he's finished speaking with him when we know that God and Moshe will have a conversation between the time that the Egel happens and the time that God gives Moshe the luchot? Okay, so we have to do
the berito. Right, Klapper. Yeah. So, could you say that the Rabbanan then are specifically understanding it as the daber ito is specifically the the teacher and student discussion of Torah, as opposed to kind of the wrap up sending Moshe down. And by the way, Moshe, when you go down, things are on fire.
So yeah, right. That's right. We'll have to say some. We'll have to say something of the sort of claiming that the conversation that takes place about the Egel is a different kind of conversation, a different kind of God speaking with Moshe than happened previously. And so we can say when he finished that conversation, and the fact that there's another conversation afterwards is irrelevant, right? Your suggestion is right if we pull in that medrash is that when they finish studying Torah together in that particular way, right? So that gets you the very toe. I'm not sure that's the best way to do it. We'll see. But that's fundamentally what we have to claim is that the Rabbanim have the advantage of saying that these episodes are in chronological order. We'll see how big an advantage that is. And Rabbi Levi has the advantage of saying, right, of the saying that there actually is a cessation of speech between Moshe and God, which there's no way that the Rabbanim can say prima facie. There's no way that the Rabbanim can say that God and Moshe really finished speaking to each other, even for the short term, at the time that God gave Moshe. So let's see how the Mefarshim try and make these distinct conversations. Rashi says, "L'daberito hachukim v'mishpatim shebe'ela mishpatim." So Rashi says it's when God finishes speaking with Moshe, the conversation about Parshat Mishpatim. Okay, that's really interesting, right? So Rashi says at the end of all that stuff about Parshat Mishpatim, but we're in Parshat Tisa, so Parshat Truma and Tisa, according to Rashi, not happening. So Rashi, in one hand, he's keeping it in chronological order, I guess, right? Because God finishes speaking with Parshat Mishpatim to him, he gives Moshe the Luchot, and then the Egel happens. That's great, but what about Parshat Truma and Tisa? Right? That's a pretty radical claim that Rashi says that we're going back all the way back there. We're going to see in a moment, right? How and why people do this. But just realize, right? While I'm introducing Rashi, to realize that hang on a second, right? That even the people who think we're going in order are not really going in order, because Rashi skips two parshas in between that seem to take right. It seems that we had Mishpatim, and we finished Parshas Mishpatim, and then we get to Truma Tetzaveh, and they're at right, and then we have a flashback to the end of Mishpatim. So why do we do that? Okay, Rav Hirsch tries to remove that problem in Rashi. He says, "Vayitena Moshe." Actually, so first thing Rav Hirsch says is a really interesting point, which I think we have to address. He says, "Hanosei shel hapasuk Hashem eino muskar mufurash." Hang on a sec. If you look at the beginning of the pasuk, says, "Vayitain el Moshe." Vayitain Moshe. Who gave to Moshe? You might think, it must be that the previous pasuk, where it had God as the subject, and so Vayitain el Moshe must be right, just assuming the implicit subject of the previous pasuk. But Rav Hirsch tells you no, that's not the case. Right, Rav Hirsch says that Hanosei shel pasuk, the subject of this verse, Hashem, eino muskar mefurash is not explicit. Ella midaykim oto miparsha kudemet she'la nismach pasuk. Right, he does say. Right, he says it really comes from the previous parsha, and therefore, first we'll see if that's compelling or not. And therefore, first says, therefore, you get the idea that the giving of luchot is not something that is an independent scene that was going on. Right, that at some point God just stands up and says, "Here, Moshe, take the luchot." It's connected from what happened previously. Rather, it's the conclusion of everything that happened previously. Everything that happened before the giving of luchot serve as the necessary introduction, right, the sine qua non for the giving of luchot. Right, therefore, he says, "Kol tam hakamat mishkan l'mad idusu." The whole purpose of the mishkan, right? This is a Midrashic dispute later, right? In the same way that there's a dispute in Bereshit about whether the world is created for human beings, and that's why that order, or whether human beings are just the capstone of the creation of the world. So he says, right, the purpose of the Mishkan is to house the luchot, and right, it's not the luchot are the capstone of the Mishkan, but the Mishkan exists only for the sake of luchot. And right, and Rav Hirsch's classic thing he says, and the really beautiful thing about the Mishkan is that other religions of the time have as their centerpiece is is the image of what God looks like, and what we have is the image with luchot of what human beings are supposed to be. Right, so the center of our religion is an image of humanity, and not an image, right? Not an image of God, and a statement of what God wants for humanity, not for human beings just to adore. Okay, that's Rav L'Shita. What interests me is his claim. What Rav Hirsch is saying is we're going to read it like Rashi, the Kichalatol, the Berito, and without the midrash, the specific midrash, but the way that Marty read it, it has to be that Kichalatol, the Berito means when God finished teaching Moshe Torah content. But Rav Hirsch goes away from Rashi because Rashi says it's only Parshas Mishpatim. Let's figure out why does Rashi do that. Rav Hirsch says no, it means Parshas Mishpatim and Truman Tetzaveh, and that God has to tell Moshe all that before Moshe can get to the Torah. Okay, I'm not going to evaluate that theologically now. I just wanted to put all those literary options out now so we can, right? So we know that Kichalatol Divrei Torah can mean when he finishes teaching in Parshat Mishpatim. It can mean when he finishes teaching in Parshat Mishpatim and Truma and Tetzaveh, or it can mean when he finishes the conversation after the Egel HaZahav. Let's see how all these things play out literally. Okay, so let's start by taking a look at Perek Lamed Bet. Remember, this is right. The pasuk we read is the last pasuk of Perek Lamed Aleph. So here's what follows it, right? So he gives Moshe the luchot, and so now there's an immediate shift back, which makes the chronology more plausible because God gives Moshe the luchot, and we think that's the end of the 40 days and 40 nights, although it doesn't say so explicitly. It just says he finished speaking with him, so we can say that he finished speaking with him on day 39. But the scene shifts now, Perek Lamed Bet, from heaven to earth. Right. So now Moshe is up in Shemayim, and the people see that Moshe is late, and they demand from Aaron. They say, Aaron, make us a god because Moshe is gone. And Aaron tells them, give me the jewelry, and they do. And Aaron makes an egel, and everything goes right. Everything goes wrong, and that's the end of the scene. Right. And now they wake up the next day. Right. So this scene takes place on Earth. There's an overnight scene. The people see that Moshe is late. They demand Aaron makes them a god. In some way, the egel is formed. They wake up the next morning. Okay, now that's the end of the scene on Earth, and now we go back to heaven. And God says to Moshe, Lech. Here's our first real ambiguity. Does God say to Moshe, Lech? Is that after he was Kichalatol Divrei, he gave the luchot, and now he speaks to him again? Or do we say, no, hang on a second, it says Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe. So obviously, right, this has to be part of the prequel. Right? We go back to what happened on Earth before God gave Moshe the luchot, right? If we're taking that position that the egel takes place before the luchot, this is Rabbi Levi. And then having gone back in time before on Earth before that scene, we go back to what happens in heaven before the scene. All right, or is this the next sequence? Right, that's the ambiguity everybody has. Right, the Bereshel and Moshe, but it's not problematic to say that it's a flashback because the previous chapter, all right, went back on Earth. So there's nothing unreasonable about saying that the timelines of the narrative of heaven and the narrative of Earth, right, jump back and forth because there's no way to have them happen exactly in tandem. Right, you can't. The Torah doesn't exist in parallel columns, so you can track what happens in heaven and Earth simultaneously. Okay, so God says to Moshe, go down, right, because the Jews have done this terrible thing. And that's the end, right? And that's right, and that's all right, that's scene one. Then we have a new thing, right? After God tells Moshe what terrible, and he says go down, then God firstly shifts from Vayomer to Vayidaber. You have to decide whether that's significant, whether Vayomer, right, whether Kichalatol, the very toe, can't be talking about the scene that happened with Yomer. You also have to ask yourself whether Kichalatol, the very toe, can't be talking about things of Vayidaber Hashem El. Right? Both of these are reasons to say that this is not the conversation referred to in the pasuk, because either the verb or the indirect sorry, I'm blanking. The relative pronoun is not getting the right word, is preposition. The preposition is is wrong. And God says to Moshe, I have seen these people in their and now leave me be. Okay, and I'll wipe them out and make you a great nation. And then we have the scene that, right, you all know from Lane, hearing Lane so often on Tanit Sibur. Moshe pleads with God, and he convinces God, right? He says to God, right, what will he try and say, all right, remember Abraham Yaakov, the whole speech, and Hashem changes his mind. and then Moshe goes down. Right? So it's very tempting to say, as Rabbi Levi says, that look here, for the first time, we have a conversation. Right? God talked to Moshe, and it says, not only Daber El, it's Vayomer El, and maybe that's already part of that. And what he says to Moshe is taken correct by Moshe as an invitation to respond. And then Moshe talks to God, and then God changes his mind. Right? So it's perfectly reasonable to say this paragraph is the Dibur Ito that that precedes the Luchot, and God gives Moshe the Luchot immediately after the Egel Zahav. So that raises the question, right? And really, what God is saying here is, right? He's saying is, leave me alone. I'll destroy them, and I'll give you the right, and I'll give you the Luchot yourself, or I won't give you the Luchot them. However you want to play it out. And afterwards, he gives Moshe the Luchot for Bnei Israel, maybe, or it could be that in the end, Moshe doesn't give the Bnei Israel either, right? So we have to, if we're trying to figure out what this means, we have to figure out why it matters that God gives Moshe the Luchot anyway, even if Moshe doesn't bring the Luchot to Bnei Israel, and that will play into the difficulty in the Midrash we saw earlier about who the groom is who receives the Torah as the Kala. Okay, right. So we understand perfectly well the claim that we understand that the claims that the Luchot that are given before the Egel Zahav has to somehow mean that there's a difference between Torah conversation and this conversation. This conversation happens sequentially, and this whole seems to happen sequentially. Right? Maybe if really make it work, right? The whole scene in which the people first go to Aaron, not just the making of the Egel, but the holy patience, all that has to happen with Moshe already having the Luchot. Then the question is, why doesn't Moshe go down immediately? Right? Why does that God waits to give him the Torah until after the Egel Zahav is already made? Does he wait to give him the Torah while the people wake up in the morning? Or, right? We don't know. Right? The next scene tells that Moshe goes down. We don't know whether Moshe starts down the mountain at night before they make the Egel Zahav. At night after they make the Egel Zahav, or in the morning when they're or even after the party in the morning. We don't know about that, but we know our options are Torah conversation ended or the Egel Zahav conversation ended. Moshe goes down the mountain. He gets there, right? He asks Aaron what happened. Aaron gives him his description. Okay, Moshe stands and he says, Mila Shamilai, and there's the civil war, although it's not clear anyone resisted the Levium. And then is the day after again. Okay, Vahim Lacharat. So Moshe gets up in the morning and he tells them, you've sinned a great sin. And then Moshe goes and has another conversation with God. And Moshe goes back to God and he says, they have sinned a great sin. And God says, right, and wipe me out if you're going to wipe them out. And God forgives him. And then, then bad things happen. So it could be, right? The problem we have is saying Kichalotol de Berito took place over here is that this doesn't finish the conversation either, right? This also seems like just a preliminary conversation because Moshe has to come back and talk to God about the Egel. Over here, he goes back up the mountain. So it might be that the reason you don't like, and pretty much nobody thinks you can postpone the Luchot to the second time, to after the second time Moshe goes, you can't because the whole before Moshe goes down, goes up the second time, he comes down the first time and he's carrying the Luchot and he breaks them. So reason to not say that it looks really good that the very toe means the conversation about the Egel is that that's not the end of the conversation either. So that can't be Gechal told the very toe. Right, that conversation, right, because that's not the end of the conversation either. It's just a break, right? Moshe says, I'll go down, and then Moshe comes back. Okay. Problems all the way through. Okay, so now we're going to take a little bit of a look at how the Rishonim addressed this issue. Rashi, playing on what he said earlier, it says, the Torah is not in any order at all. The Egel came before the Mishkan many days, and Rashi gives you a timeline. It says the Egel has to come before the Sibuk for the Mishkan, and therefore Parshas Truma and Tetzaveh have to be after all of this, and you have to figure your own explanation as to how that plays out. Ezra says something really interesting. He says the Tam Kichol Tzol Devirito, Devar HaMishkan VeHaShabbat. So Ezra takes what we had. Rashi, who said it goes back to Parshat Mishpatim. Rav says it's everything from Matan Torah on, and Ezra leaves out Parshat Mishpatim. And he says it's only talking about the Mishkan, and then he puts in something that we've all forgotten about now. He says also God tells him about Shabbos. let's take a look and see, right, what is Shabbos doing in here? Okay, so where do people get these ideas? So if you take a look at the end of Parshat Mishpatim, so even though Parshat Mishpatim, right, we know right, most of Parshat Mishpatim is just a list of laws that seem to come out of nowhere. Ve'elam Mishpatim, right? We talked about that in Parshat Mishpatim. The end of Parshat Mishpatim says that God says to Moshe, "Go up on the mountain," and the last pasuk of Parshat Mishpatim is Moshe enters the Anan and he goes up the mountain, and Moshe is on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Okay, so it turns out there's a chronological issue all the way through. Parshat Mishpatim ends by saying Moshe went up and stayed on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, what does he do for 40 days and 40 nights? So the easiest answer is, and this is what Ibn Ezra says, is that after Parshat Mishpatim, Moshe spends 40 days and 40 nights learning about the Mishkan, which is Parshat Truma and Tisa. And then, right, and then at the end of those 40 days, God gives Moshe the Luchot, and right, and he comes down. The only problem is that it's a little bit messy because God also tells him the beginning of Parshat Tisa. So we can say that's right. That's also part of that the maintenance of the Mishkan in some way. And he also tells about Shabbos. So we'll say, okay, Shabbos and Mishkan are intimately related. So we understand how Ezra gets that. That's Kichalotol de Berito. The end of Parshat Mishpatim says Moshe goes up on the mountain, and God talks to him for a while, and then he finishes. And you understand how Rashi has to say Mukdam B'Char Torah because Rashi actually thinks that the end of Parshat Mishpatim happens before the beginning of it, because it's in those 40 days and 40 nights that are described in the last sentence of Parshat Mishpatim that God tells Moshe about the rest of Parshat Mishpatim. Okay, so now what really happens just before, however, right? If it were just the Mishkan, life would be great, and if it had its reason. So what really happens in the beginning of Parak Lamed is first God tells Moshe about B'Tzalel creating the Mishkan, and then there's this long thing about the Mishkan, right? You speak to the Israel, keep Shabbos, because Shabbos is an ot b'ni v'nechem l'dorotechem, l'dat kani Hashem mikadeshchem. Shabbos is really important proof, and then we have right and keep Shabbos because you don't keep Shabbos, right? People don't keep Shabbos die or get kares, do work for 6 days, and the Shabbos is kodesh. And Israel, right? Then, the more famous sukkim, right? Sharu Israel the Shabbat, Lazar the Shabbat, the Ratam Brit Olam. Right? It's an Otili Olam Kishri Massage Shabbat the Shemaim Aretz. Shabbat V'Nefash. The thing is, so it's true that there's always a relation between Shabbos and the Mishkan. This is just one of the many places where Shabbat and the Mishkan are intimately connected, and all the language of the construction of the Mishkan, right? It's pretty clear that the Mishkan is a microcosm, and the construction of and it represents the world, and so the Mishkan has to be related to Shabbos and the creation of the world that way. But the specific description of Shabbos here does not relate to the Mishkan at all in any way directly. It uses all sorts of other language, and the key language it uses, I think, is ot, right? Keep Shabbos, ki oti, b'ni v'nechem l'dorotechem. Right? It's a permanent oath between you. That language shows up here, and then it shows up again. Israel oti liolam. Over here you have the Dorotam. The point is that what happens immediately before the line, by Tain Kechalotol Moshe, let's watch again. He emphasizes that it's Lukota Edut, right, which is parallel to language used up here as well. What it seems to me is that if we were thinking literally, that the parsha of Shabbos precedes the giving of Luchot because it's a place in which God establishes an eternal covenant between the Jews and God that's not conditional, and so it's the antithesis to the whole struggle about the ego, and it also is not conditional in the Mishkan either. Right? It's not been built on something tangible in the world existing. It's the whole world. The whole world stands as a model of a permanent bris between God and the Jewish people. I think that's the most I think that's the most logical thing. And maybe, right, you can say maybe that's what God told Moshe just before he sent him down. Or you can say that it's just the Torah's way of understanding that when God gives Moshe the Torah, what he's doing is reaffirming the brit of Matan Torah. Okay. But all the other explanations, I think, have failed to really account well for why Shabbos happens previously, and maybe you don't like my explanation at all either. Okay, the Torah Hamor has the kind of explanation that I really don't like, but I have to put it in, and probably some of you will like it. Right? He says that the whole purpose of Kechalato is that God gives Moshe the Torah exactly when he finishes teaching it to him, and therefore there was no excuse for the Jews saying Moshe is late, because Moshe wasn't stalling. He was ready. He came down exactly at the first moment he had it. This is the kind of explanation that doesn't appeal to me. And if I wanted to, attack it on its own terms, I would say no. It should say Bichaloto, that God gave Moshe the Luchot exactly at the moment that he's done. And it says Kichaloto, like his bedroom. Okay, so you should know somebody said you can buy it out if you want. Make the Vars Netziv has another interesting claim about the structure of the pasuk. This means Lashon Mikra. Yaroi lichtov vayiki chaloto the very top Har Sinai natan el Moshe shnei luchot. I'm not sure if he's entirely right about what you expect from biblical grammar, although the same biblical grammar a lot better than I did. But he points out that regardless of whether it's what you expect or not, the structure of the pasuk is odd. It's the sentence structure that I use often, but that my wife and all the people who read the Torah Advanced try and get me to change out, which is the sort of copy thing, where it's after you give an opening sentence, then you put in a parentheses that was really important to know really before you started. He gave to Moshe when he had finished speaking with him at Sinai. Right. So that's why are you telling me the story out of order? Just say when he finished speaking with Moshe at Sinai, he gave him the Torah. Right. Why do you say he gave him the Torah before you tell us what happened immediately before? So the Tiv has Kedarka B'Kodesh has a way out of this. He says, Elabala made the Gamzeh Kilal Deverito Hu Bichlal Hanatina. It comes to teach you that the finishing of the speech was part of the giving. Right? So you can't really understand what he meant to give. Right? It's not that he stopped and therefore he gave. It's that the giving involved stopping. Why? Gamzeh Natan Lo B'Matana. The Tiv has his own interpretation. The way we talked about how in Hasidic literature everything is about the psychology of the relationship between God and the Jewish people, or your individual relationship to God. The Tiv, basically everything in the Torah is about the study of Torah. So so here, what it means that God's finished speaking with him is that he gave Moshe full recall. And Moshe did not have to engage in effort anymore to understand Torah. He could just focus, and just naturally the Torah just flowed out of him. Okay, that's his understanding of Matana. I don't know that I'm so convinced by this. There's a whole general question I read about Torah some years ago, where I think it might have been within it too. I don't remember exactly where is the irony that Moshe Rabbeinu knows all of Torah and therefore never gets the fundamental rabbinic experience of Torah, which is being creative. And you know everything already. You can't be creative. We'll have to talk about whether that's true or not. But I think you can use it as Tiv's reading, and Tiv's reading would say that if we go back to Rav Hirsch's thing and saying that God gives Moshe the Torah, and stopping to speak to Moshe is part of that, because he gives him the Torah with instructions. Right, the joke that say in yeshiva, right, that sometimes when they give you your smicha, right, not always a joke, right, some smicha give you authority to issue halachic rulings, and some smichos come with your teacher's phone number on the back. And and they say, right, yes, if you ever get a difficult question, go look it up, right? Right, when I finally got my smicha, some years, right, Deborah made a big production, turn around, look at the back to see if it was a phone number on it or not. So we could just say that, so giving Moshe the Torah silently.
For the record, it's blank on the back, and it was a joke.
We broke the frame now, so we can check again. But yes, thank you. Because it could be that, of course, that none of them were willing to take my calls, but we'll try not to assume it was that. We could.
So I guess the real question is, was everybody else's blank too?
Right, you have to know, right? You have to know, right? We should require, right? I guess rabbis to put their smicha not on the wall, right, but to hang it right from the ceiling, so you can, right, in clear frames, you can look at the front and the back. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything. Any case, so the we could say that, right, that God giving the Luchot to Moshe silently, right? The silence is part of the giving, because if you give somebody the Torah while you're still speaking, you're still giving them instructions, and it's clear you never intend to stop giving them instructions, that's not really a gift, right? That would be another way of reading the whole thing together. Okay, right, so we have a whole series of explanations, but I'm not sure that any of them is really satisfactory, because there's no real point where we're happy saying that God and Moshe ever finished speaking, because the conversation about the eagle also goes on later, and the conversation about Torah doesn't fit literally or temporally. We don't have really good explanations. So at the end of all this, we still don't have a great explanation and chronology of what it is that the Beri Toe means that God and Moshe stopped doing before he got the Luchot. Okay, so now I want to point out another ambiguity, which I think was hinted at briefly above, but not really well enough. I want to do it by analogy. We're going to go back to Bereshis. And in Bereshis, so God says, "Am I hiding from Abraham what I'm going to do?" And he gives an explanation as to why he won't hide from Abraham the he won't hide from Abraham the destruction of Sodom. And then, right, the people leave Abraham and they go to Sodom. Abraham is still standing before God. So the famous machlokas Rashi and Rashbam, whether it's really Abraham is still standing before God. When was Abraham before God? Right, and that goes right, right. So one explanation is that it's really God is still standing before Abraham, but it's a tikkun so frame at Rashi that it wouldn't be polite to say that God was still standing before Abraham. Really, Abraham is still standing. But really, that's what the case is. The other explanation is that Abraham is actually still standing before God, even though we've had this long interregnum, because it's the scene that begins at the beginning of Parshas Lech when the angels appear. When God started by Yerushalayim Abraham, which is interrupted by the angels. Fine. Okay, then Abraham gets up before God, and they have the whole really long conversation about the bargaining conversation about Sodom. At the end of the conversation, right, the conversations get shorter and shorter. Right, Abraham always has the introduction. Well, I can't believe I'm having the audacity to speak this way, but maybe it's 30, maybe 20. Each time God just says, "Nope, you're right. I won't destroy them if they're 20." And finally, God says, "I won't destroy them before they're 10." And then it says, "Vayelech Hashem kasher kila l'daber el Abraham." So God leaves kasher kila l'daber el Abraham. Here it doesn't say l'daber im Abraham. It's kasher kila l'daber el Abraham. But let's note that same, right, there's the same substantive claim, right, that God left when he finished speaking with Abraham. But there's an ambiguity here, which I think is central to that whole parsha, which is God leaves when he finishes speaking with Abraham, but does that mean that Abraham was finished speaking too? Abraham means, right, says that God left when he finished speaking to Abraham, but does that mean that Abraham was finished speaking with him, or that God left because he was no longer interested in speaking with Abraham? Right? There's ambiguity whenever when you say a conversation ended. Does the conversation end because one or the other party chose to leave the conversation, or does it end because the parties mutually agree to leave the conversation? If we take that back to the beginning of this week, so now we can look and say, so God gives to Moshe when he finishes speaking with him. So in the same way that we don't know at this stage who the giver is, the truth is that we don't know who ends the conversation here. You have a number of possibilities. It could be that he gave to Moshe when Moshe finished speaking with him. And if you think that it's a conversation about the ego, that's what it has to be, because the last words in the conversation of the ego are Moshe's, not right. Are Moshe's, not God's. All it says Vayinachem Hashem. God changed his mind. It doesn't say that God said anything. Or it could be that he changed, right, that he gave to Moshe when God finished speaking with Moshe, which can either be God finished telling Moshe the Torah, or it can take the very toe the way right, the Midrash refers that it's say it that when they're speaking together about the Torah. It could be that we're speaking together and that one or the other wanted to keep speaking together, and the other one said, "No, right, we were speaking together, and now I'm not speaking with you, so the conversation is over." Right, so I wanted to put up that ambiguity. And with that ambiguity in mind, I now wanted to go to the story of Moshe in Rabbi Akiva's classroom that probably many of you are familiar with. Here's the story. Right, let's take a look at it. quickly. So Rabbi Yehuda says it's Rabbi Yehuda's name of Rav. When Moshe goes up to Lamarom, to heavens, he finds God tying the letters onto the Otziot, and he says, God, who is restraining you? So the way in which this is generally understood, I think I can have it in Rashi here. How do you have it in Rashi? Is who is restraining you? So who is saying that you can't give the Torah yet? You have to tie the crowns onto letters before you give the Torah, and that means that this scene takes place just before God gives Moshe the Luchot. Okay, so God says to him, there's a person, right, and many years from now, who's named Akiva, who's going to learn enormous heaps of halachos from each of the points of the crowns of the letters. We're going to assume now the crowns of the letters are things like the tagim that Rashi talks about. That's a whole separate conversation. And that's I have to put them on. So it's Rabbi Akiva who is preventing me from giving the Torah as is. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, "Show him to me," and God says, turn back. And he shows up at Akiva's classroom famously and doesn't understand anything. He gets depressed. The students ask the students. The students get to one thing in Rabbi Akiva's classroom and they ask Rabbi Akiva, "What's your source?" And Rabbi Akiva says, "Halacha Moshe Sinai." Right, it's just a tradition from Moshe, and now Moshe is removed. Right, the word is right. His depression is relieved. He goes in front of God and he says, "Why are you giving the Torah through me instead of through Rabbi Akiva?" And God tells him, "Be silent." And then he says, "Ribono shel olam, you told me the Torah, show me his reward." And he shows him Rabbi Akiva's flesh being weighed in the marketplaces, and he says, "Tu Torah zu schara." And God says to him, "Shtok, be silent. This is what came up in machshava before me." Okay, so here's what I want to say. This is a conversation between God and Moshe that takes place just before God gives Moshe the Torah. So what I think this midrash is based on is they said, you know what? None of the other dialogue between God and Moshe that we find in the Torah fits well as an explanation of what it is that Kechalotol the very Torah means. So they said there must be some other conversation that is not in the Torah that happens between God and Moshe just before I gave him the Luchot, and this is the conversation they came up with. Right. So this is a rabbinic filling of the gap. Right. What is Kechalotol the very Torah? And this is pretty dramatic because how does Kechalotol the very Torah end? It ends with God telling Moshe, "Be quiet." So the conversation doesn't. It's not right. It can be both of the very Torah that are speaking together, and yet that it's God making the decision. Because what God, right, I think that's how the rabbis are reading this, is that God gives Moshe the Torah when God finishes speaking with him. It is a conversation, but it's God's decision to end the conversation, and he ends the conversation by giving Moshe the Torah, and it's very dramatic. And he tells him, right, so it's a really weird conversation where it seems the entire purpose of the conversation is to yield the point where God tells Moshe that the conversation is over. Right, so that's a really interesting kind of conversation you have, right? Where the whole purpose of the conversation is to get somebody to ask a question, which you will then refuse to answer. So I want to leave right there. I think is the first level to understanding what that story really means. I want to give credit to this point also. Bought last week a book called The Crowns. I'll stop the screen for a moment. Called the Crowns on the Letters by Aryeh, which so I'm going to plug it. So I read the chapter this Shabbos, last Shabbos on the on this story, which I had thought that there was not so much more I could say about the story, and there were several things in the chapter that really opened up the story for me in a new way, and led me to this conclusion, although it's not something he says. And I'm going to give you one thing that he says about the story, which I think is also beautiful, and I had not seen, I think, anywhere near it as in detail as he had. And that will also help us understand the story. And that's probably all we can do tonight. And now the story is new again, we could revisit it in the future. So the thing that Rabbi Khan points out, well, two things that Rabbi Khan points out really well. One is, he says, so Moshe sees Rabbi Akiva in the classroom, And then he asks God, show me his schar, and God shows Rabbi Akiva's flesh being weighed in the marketplace. But that's not how Rabbi Akiva's life does not go directly from the classroom to his flesh being weighed in the marketplace. What happens, as we learn in Gemara and Brachos, is that when Rabbi Akiva is being taken out for teaching Torah in public, right? When Rabbi Akiva is being taken out, he's reading Kriyat Shema, and they're combing his flesh, and Rabbi Akiva is being the kabel of Malchus Shemayim, and the students say, really now you're accepting the yoke of heaven? And he says, basically, all my life I was in agony about this pasuk. It says, right, this is my drasha. The whole nafshecha afilu noten, right? About Hashem l'kecha, love God, the whole nafshecha, the whole nafshecha, the whole neodecha. How do I know, right? What does it mean to love God, the whole nafshecha, even if you have to sacrifice your life? And I said, when will I fulfill this? Now that it comes to my mind, will I not fulfill it? And so he dies saying, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and a heavenly voice comes out. And now I'm going to just ask a couple of questions and leave it to you. You can email me, or we can say and tell you what you think it means. So guess what happens at that moment? The angels ask the same question as Moshe Rabbeinu. They say, "Zu Torah v'zu schara." This is Torah. This is reward. What happens to Rabbi Akiva? And God does not say to them, "Be silent." God gives them an answer, which seems basically to say, "Don't worry, he's going to Olam Haba." So why does God show Moshe Rabbeinu? Why does God show Moshe Rabbeinu, right, not answer Moshe Rabbeinu's question the way he answered the angel's question? That's A. B. Why does God show Moshe the scene of Rabbi Akiva after this powerful scene? Rabbi Akiva shows you that he is actually accepting his martyrdom in some ways, even with joy and certainly with beauty. Instead, right, God shows him the scene afterwards, which has no beauty at all, which is just horror. But in between, where God shows Moshe Rabbi Akiva in his classroom, God shows Moshe with his flesh being weighed in the marketplace. He doesn't show Rabbi Akiva saying this line, right? I always thought, when was I going to fulfill this pasuk? So God seems to be going out of his way to make Moshe ask him a question, not give him an answer, and not even help him understand what might be an answer. Now, what Rabbi Khan points out, which I think had not gotten at all, was that in case you missed the story, right? So the narrator of the story, the Merah wants you to know and remember that this is a story about the Rabbi Akiva whose soul departed on the word echad, right? Because of that was so critical to him. Because how does God introduce Rabbi Akiva? He says, Adam echad yesh. And what are they learning about? The learning in Rabbi Akiva's classroom is kevan shehigiel devar echad. So, right, so the language of the story is designed to send you back to brachot, even though Moshe Rabbeinu never gets to brachot. So that seems to be a very cool mystery. That can add great depth to this Agadah. Okay, another thing which I did know, I knew it from Dessler, and Khan roots it back to the Maharal. The Maharal doesn't make the connection of the Gemara Brachot explicit, but I think it's probably correct that it's obviously had in mind, is that God says to Moshe, Kach alav b'machshava, and Kach alav b'machshava is the language that Rashi uses in the Midrash to say that God originally thought of the world as existing. He wanted the world to exist only in Din. That's why the name for God in Bereshit Perek Aleph is Elokim, and then he realizes the world can't survive without Din and Rachmim together. So starting in the recreation of the Gan Eden story is always Hashem Elokim, because Hashem Elokim together is Rachmim and Din. And so the Maharal and the Dessler all say that what happens to Rabbi Akiva is Rabbi Akiva has the opportunity to live in the world the way in which it was God originally thought of creating it, the Elam Machshava world. Right, there's another connection between the stories that God gives an answer which sends us to Rabbi Akiva, and yet doesn't show him what really makes Rabbi Akiva explicable. The last thing I'm going to say is that I think there's another tension which is not filled out, which is that God says to Moshe, "I'm giving the Torah because there are all these with the crown. I can't give the Torah without the crown, so the Akiva is going to derive all these things from the crowns." And yet, at the end, right, what satisfies Moshe is that a student asks Rabbi Akiva, "How do you know this halacha?" And Rabbi Akiva doesn't say, "I got it from this crown." Rabbi Akiva says, "I got it halacha Moshe Sinai." So, what's the point of attaching the crowns to the letters if in fact, at the end of the day, the letters aren't comprehensive, even the crowns of the letters aren't comprehensive, there are still details that the only way you can know them is by saying Halacha l'Moshe Misinai. And why do we bother having the crowns, right? What is it, right? Why not make everything Halacha l'Moshe Misinai? So there's this deep tension in it. In the written virtue, I wanted to suggest that the really powerful thing here is that maybe Rabbi Akiva students can't get anything with the crowns either. Maybe the crowns are just there for Rabbi Akiva, but at the end of the day, Rabbi Akiva, at the end of the day, if Rabbi Akiva can't show that what he derives from the letters that no one else gets are from the crowns, the students don't get it either. And so that's in some way what works for Moshe Rabbeinu. But for me, the key things to get out of here is understanding that this story is a attempt to resolve the problem of what does Kichalotol de Verito, in which they come up with a dialogue which they think this is the thing, right? This is the thing that Moshe Rabbeinu had to understand, that God thought Moshe Rabbeinu had to understand before you could give him the Torah. You can decide whether this story takes place before or after the Egel Zahav, and that it's a fact, right? They play in both Kichalotol and the Verito by saying that it has to be a conversation, but it has to be that God ends the conversation, and this is very dramatically by saying that God says, be silent. And that in addition to God telling Moshe to be silent, God also doesn't give Moshe Rabbeinu all the evidence. So it's something Moshe Rabbeinu has to understand, but he also has to be able to figure out for himself. If God told it to him somehow, then it wouldn't work. So that didn't tell it to me. So I'm not entirely sure what it is that Moshe Rabbeinu was supposed to understand and how it works. There was an attempt in the written version, but more than glad to listen to your ideas as to how it can play out, either now, as always, or in emails to Modern Torah Leadership at Gmail during the week. Okay, thank you. So up to you. People have comments, questions, suggestions?
I have a very mundane question,
Sure.
which is, if you're making, if you're interpreting based on the crowns of the letters, how do you account for when the Torah was originally given, they were using the Canaanite script and they didn't use the Aramaic script until later.
Okay, right. So that is a good down to earth question, so to speak. Rashi says K'ain Tagin. Right. First of all, we're not talking about a scroll. We're talking about the luchot, right? Right. We're talking about letters carved by God in stone, right? That's the thing, right? So Rashi says Kigon Tagin. Right. He means something like the crowns on the letters. So historians have all sorts of issues about when the crowns on the letters happen. I don't think it should be understood literally. Right. There are most people. I forget who it was. There were a whole long piece earlier this year about what was really. I had a conversation with Alan Dykin. I forgot to look it up as to what exactly this midrash means by the crowns of the letters. Does it even mean those crowns as referred to something entirely different? A whole midrashic tradition. Right? There are many midrashic traditions about crowns. Most of the crowns are on the Jews, right? The Jews leave their crowns when they leave Har Choreh. The angels come and take the Jews' crowns off. So I tend to think that at most the crowns and letters are a metaphor, and maybe we're even misunderstanding it by thinking that the metaphor is the things we include in the script. Might be that what we say is that the things we include in the script are attempts to concretize whatever the metaphor was that they were using there. Is that a helpful answer? It fudges in many ways.
It is a answer.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try and find, if you remember, I can find the article that I read about what the crowns meant other than the script. I don't remember. I think I probably having this conversation with my son Gershon. Perhaps he'll probably remember. He'll probably remember where it was, because he was probably the one who brought the question to me.
Also, like almost many modern Jewish authors have stories about crowns.
Okay. And that's what's an example?
Well, there's Crown of Feathers, Bezhevish Singer. There's a
Aha.
story about crowns by Malamud. And there's
Interesting.
also, I think Cynthia Ozick also wrote a story about a crown.
Interesting. Okay, cool. And there are lots of crowns. You know, the crown of Torah, the crown of Guna, the crown of right, the crown of monarchy, right? That's all over the
Crown Heinz, yes.
three crowns. Yeah. But crowns and letters. Rav Moshe Feinstein, I didn't get to put it on the card. Moshe Feinstein has this magnificent interpretation, which he says that the purpose of putting crowns on the letters is to tell you that we're textualists now. That right, God, that the letters mean what interpreters get out of them, and not what God meant anymore. Right, so he crowns the letters to tell you that, to give them their independence and their sovereignty. Right, to claim that we're not bound by original intent. We're not bound by history. That's Rav Moshe's I think very cool interpretation. Maybe that's right. Also, I don't know. Okay, I think Deborah's question in the chat is exactly right. No, right. That is that as I say, I don't like that interpretation at all. So pile on by all means. That it just means that Moshe left exactly that time. Okay. Other questions? All right then. I wish everybody a great Shabbos, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week or to hearing to my availability. Bye shalom.
Thank you.
You're welcome.